Good to go.
Okay, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Lexington Fayette Urban County Government, I want to welcome you to the workshop on redevelopment and also on 404 permitting. My name is Richard Walker. I'm with Tetra Tech. We are the city's MS4 program manager. And I'll be facilitating the workshop and also giving the first presentation on redevelopment. The agenda is on the screen about what we are doing today. I'm going to start it off on the stormwater management requirements for redevelopment. Doug Burton with the Division of Engineering will talk about the development procedures. Lindsay Nicholas in the Division of Water Quality will talk about inspection and maintenance. And then we will finish it up with a presentation by Gina Morris and Rainstorm with Third Rock Consultants on some recent changes to the 404 and 401 permitting process. I'm going to ask Abby Terry to kind of go over some of the housekeeping items and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. I'm Abby Terry, also with Tetra Tech. Just a few things to go over before we get started here. We will be giving out PDHs. When you leave the meeting today, an evaluation survey should pop up, and one of the questions will ask if you want one. So just mark yes there. If for some reason it doesn't pop up for you, just send me an email and we'll get you added to the list. My email is abby.terry@tetratech.com, and I'll put that in the chat for you. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation. This is set up as a meeting format, so if you have a question, feel free to enter it into the chat or unmute yourself and ask. We are recording this, so if you would like to share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it, just let us know and we'll get you a link. And if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to shoot me an email or call me and I'll do my best to help you. I think that's all I have, Richard. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Abby. I'm going to pull up my presentation here. So we're going to talk about redevelopment. And before we begin, we have 3 poll questions that Lindsay is going to launch to help us better understand who is in the audience and some other things. So go ahead, Lindsay.
As I see the majority of people participating, I'll end the poll and share results and start the new one. There's just 3. First one is, what organization are you with? Give everybody about 40 seconds there. We'll end it in a minute. That's not true. I'll end it in a couple seconds.
So Lindsay, I stepped away for just a minute. So which ones have you launched?
Just the first one. So I've
Okay.
shared the results of the first one right there. You should be able to see it on your screen.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that and launch the next one. Second question, have you prepared or reviewed an executive summary stormwater management plan? You should see that pop up on your screen. All right. Just shared the results of that, just getting a feel for our audience. So hopefully you see that on your screen, Richard.
I do, about half. That's good.
All right, and I'm going to launch the third one. This is, have you used the water quality volume spreadsheet? So you should see that on your screen as well. Now we're getting the hang of it. Quick responses. Just a couple more seconds. All right, and sharing the results now for that.
Okay, about a third have. Very good.
All right. That's all we had. Thank you for participating in the polls.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, and thanks everybody for joining the workshop and participating in the poll questions. So we're going to talk about redevelopment. Hang on just a second here. So here are the main topics that I'm going to be talking about. Some of the common questions about redevelopment that have come up over the years, a little bit of history of the Stormwater Manual, some of the key definitions, and then the actual requirements in the manual related to water quantity and water quality, and then a couple of examples of the executive summary form and the spreadsheet.
Hey, Richard.
Yes.
We are still seeing the agenda.
All right, very good. How's that?
You may need to stop sharing and pick the new screen.
Okay.
Perfect.
Very good. Thank you. All right, so I was talking from this slide about the topics we're going to cover. And before I begin, I want to make the point that what we're talking about here today are existing requirements. There are no new requirements that we are proposing or discussing. This is an overview of what's in the manual now. And we're doing the workshop primarily because over the years, there have been a lot of questions and discussions about redevelopment, how it's applied. And so we're going to try to clear up a lot of that. So from an overview regarding redevelopment in Fayette County, we typically have 20 to 30 projects annually. Half of them are usually less than an acre of disturbance. Many projects can meet the requirements by simply reducing the impervious area by 20%. The most common installed stormwater control is a manufactured treatment device. And approximately half of the projects are part of a larger common plan of development. So a couple of examples. This is Candlewood Suites on Waller Avenue, 2.6 acres of disturbance. They reduced impervious area by 6%. They didn't have to provide detention since the impervious area was reduced. And they installed a manufactured device to meet the water quality requirements. Jiffy Lube on Meyer Way, part of a larger common plan of development, 0.9 acres of disturbance, so under that acre threshold that we'll talk about here in a minute. And as part of that larger common plan of development back in the 90s, there was a detention basin put in on the other side of West Reynolds Road to control peak flow. So they didn't have to provide additional detention, but they did have to deal with water quality, and they did that by reducing impervious area by 23%. So some of the common questions that have come up over the years. Why does the city have water quantity and water quality requirements? I'm going to start with that one. We get this question a lot. Engineering gets that question a lot from engineers who are working from out of town. And the answer to that is really threefold. The first part of the answer is it's a requirement of the MS4 permit issued by the state of Kentucky that Lexington have requirements for water quality. Secondly, the consent decree required it. And thirdly, the citizens in the community expect it. So that's why we do it. Those requirements, many of them have been in place since 2001. So it's nothing new. It's been around a while. These other questions will be answered as I go through my other slides. What is redevelopment? Does it apply to remodeling? What about sites less than an acre? Does it apply to water quantity? Are stormwater controls required if there is no increase in impervious area? There's a lot in the manual about water quality volume, runoff reduction, the 80th percentile and 90th percentile storms. So we'll talk about that. Item 9 is kind of a related thing, and we put it here because it comes up quite a bit regarding parking. And then what is a common plan of development? So the main takeaways that I would like you to remember, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I'd like you to remember this. And there's a lot on this slide, so I'm going to spend just a minute on it. Stormwater standard for redevelopment. By the way, Abby, can people see my pointer?
Yes, they can.
Okay. So water quality is for projects that disturb 1 acre or more of land or that are part of a larger common plan of development. It's to control all runoff from new impervious areas. That is the same standard as new development. It's to control 20% of the runoff from existing impervious area. And really the purpose of that is to achieve incremental improvement over time, and also to provide flexible standards that don't inhibit redevelopment. And then with regard to peak flow, again, control all runoff from new impervious areas. And that is the same standard as new development. And also want to point out that engineering may require additional controls when there have been reports of flooding downstream. So I think we have to recognize that redevelopment and new development are different. The soils are many times different. We have other things going on in redevelopment that you don't have in new development. But in terms of the stormwater manual, one thing is the same between the two. And when it comes to new impervious areas, the standards for redevelopment and new development are the same. 100% of that new impervious area has to be managed in some way. So as I mentioned earlier, new development and redevelopment requirements are part of the MS4 permit, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, the acronym for that. The permit was issued to Lexington in 2015, requires the city to have a stormwater management program. And I'll make the point that the Division of Water has noted in their response to comments that the city's post-construction standard is the same as other MS4s in Kentucky, and that the 80th percentile event, they deem it to be the maximum extent practicable for Kentucky. So a little bit of history about water quality in the stormwater manual. The manual was adopted in 2001. In 2004, redevelopment standards were added. And then really, that's been the same ever since. In 2016, green infrastructure requirements were added to reduce the runoff volume. At the bottom there, you can see information about the WQV and RRV. The 90th percentile storm is 1.2 inches. The 80th percentile is 0.8 inches. You may be wondering, where does that come from? We'll talk about that here in a minute. So this chart is out of the stormwater manual, and it shows the requirements for new development on the left and redevelopment on the right. Just a few things to point out. The water quality volume is 1.2 inches. Runoff reduction is 0.8 inches. And there is a requirement for channel protection to minimize stream bank erosion by providing detention for the 10-year 6-hour storm. And then for redevelopment, no detention is required if the impervious area is not increased, because there's no increase in peak flow. And then the requirement is to reduce baseline impervious area by 20%. Where possible. When they can't do that, provide other stormwater controls. And then to emphasize the point that if there's a net increase in impervious area, the new development standards apply to that. So I'm not going to go into the next 3 slides in great detail, but this is out of the manual as well to show the typical applications depending on the date of original development. So typically before 1974, there were no detention basins, no water quality controls. Then the requirement is to implement controls for both detention and for water quality. Between 74 and 01, typically the only stormwater management facility was the detention basin. There are a few cases where there were some water quality controls, but it's primarily detention basins. So then the water quality requirements apply. And since 2001, we've had both detention and water quality controls. So fundamentally, the requirements for redevelopment are to first manage 20% of the baseline impervious plus 100% of new impervious, and provide green infrastructure for new impervious areas to reduce the runoff volume. I mentioned earlier the 80th percentile storm and the 90th. That is basically a statistical analysis. This is actually a graphic from the EPA stormwater calculator, and you can see for the 90th percentile storm, right at 1.2 inches, for the 80th, right at 0.8 inches. Key definitions, again, this is out of the manual. We didn't come up with these. They are EPA definitions. Redevelopment is something that changes the footprint of a site of a disturbance equal to or greater than an acre. It does not include remodeling. And then the larger common plan of development or sale is probably the most common topic of discussion. It's a lot of words there to define it, but it's not always clear cut. So there's a lot of discussion that goes on many times about whether a site is part of the larger common plan of development. Another key definition is the baseline condition, which is two things: the amount of impervious area on the site prior to demolition, and then also the stormwater controls that are on the site. And there is the list of available stormwater controls listed in the manual. In terms of the flexibility that a developer has, it's to first try to reduce baseline impervious by 20%. Secondly, provide BMPs for 20% of the baseline plus 100% of new impervious, or a combination of the above. So there are several scenarios that that you can see on a redevelopment project. The most common is that there's a decrease of impervious area somewhere between 0 and 20%. And then the developer has to provide additional controls for that remaining 20%. Parking areas, I mentioned earlier, this is out of the zoning ordinance. Whenever there's a project that is adding 1,800 square feet or more of parking, there has to be a stormwater system in place to handle that additional flow. So engineering deals with that on a case-by-case basis. Manufactured treatment devices, I mentioned that earlier. They can be used on new development and redevelopment when green infrastructure is not technically feasible. So what are some examples of that? Many times in a redevelopment project, the infiltration rate of the soils is less than 0.5 inches per hour. So green infrastructure just doesn't work very well. That has to be demonstrated by a field test. Sometimes there are elevation constraints. Subdrains cannot discharge to the surface, so green infrastructure that uses those will not work. If the site is in the Royal Springs Aquifer, there's sometimes a concern about potential contamination due to an oil spill or a gasoline spill. Geotechnical report may indicate a karst area. So green infrastructure is typically not a good idea in that case. And then space constraints. So how are we doing on time here? 9:25, okay. So a few more slides here. This is the executive summary form that the engineer fills out to demonstrate compliance with the things we've just talked about. They also fill out a water quality volume spreadsheet. Here's an example of where, just a hypothetical example of adding 20,000 square feet of impervious surface. So the spreadsheet calculates the water quality volume and also the runoff reduction volume. And then another example of where impervious areas is being reduced by 20%. So the spreadsheet calculates again the water quality volume as 0 and the runoff reduction volume is 0. Okay, that finished up my part. Abby, what questions do we have?
I don't see any in the chat yet, but feel free to unmute yourself. Richard has a 3-question rule, so let's help him meet his quota.
Surely there's a question or two. Well, maybe not. Maybe everybody's getting ready to go on spring break.
Richard, can you expound a little bit on the slide where you were talking
Sometimes
about a larger common plan of development. Maybe an example, you had talked about it being a challenge, but was just curious how that's normally determined or.
Well, sometimes it's, I think the confusion primarily depends on the original development of the property. So for example, we mentioned Meyer, Jiffy Lube there on Meyer Way, which is next to the Meyer store on Reynolds Road. That was done back in the 90s. So that was done before the manual was in effect. So typically that would be and that is a larger common plan of development. You had the big grocery store, you had the lots there of Jiffy Lube, a bank, a restaurant, and so forth. But sometimes things that are older than that or things that are newer, it can become confusing about, were the outlots really part of that larger common plan of development, or were they just a single parcel that got sold for a specific purpose? Does that help?
Yeah, I'm just thinking it needed a little bit more explanation, that's all.
Yeah, good.
All right, that's one. He needs two more.
Hey, Richard, this is Eric in Water Quality. Good morning.
Good morning.
Just so kind of everyone's aware, could you just take a minute and just explain a little bit when that 1,800 square foot increase in impervious area for parking lots, when does that come into play? Is that strictly commercial, or just kind of to dive into when that comes into play?
Well, I'll probably have to defer to Doug for that. He can probably give a better answer for it than I can.
Nope. Nope. you're wrong there. Can't give you a better
Sorry,
answer.
Doug.
Is Hillard on here? He knows all things. He's probably the one that's actually can give us a better answer on that.
Because I think the statement says something about parking lots. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the intent is commercial, but you know,
Okay.
we see, especially when you see some of these mega homes that get built on lots that were previously not mega homes, then you may actually see a impervious increase of that. That wasn't the intent. It's one of those things where it doesn't really have a spot. We're not sure where to put it yet.
Richard,
If that's what you're referring to here.
Richard,
Yes.
didn't this evolve out of, discussions 20 years ago when all of the conversion of single family homes to student housings up around State Street, Elizabeth Street start going on, areas that had some drainage problems, and then all of a sudden you've got 8 college students living in a single family house, and they created some additional parking around them to accommodate their vehicles. I think that's where it came from, wasn't it?
Yes, that's my understanding. It was started because of UK, a property around UK getting converted to student housing. Many times there was not an adequate storm sewer system in place to handle it. So it may have already been a problem to some degree, but that made it, much worse. So that was the reason why this article was put in place.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Richard,
Yes,
it's Fred. How you doing, by the way?
good. How are you?
Great. I've got a good question that I'm dealing with right now. You have a redevelopment in downtown Lexington, and you are increasing the impervious area of this lot. and there's no storm sewers to connect to, how do you deal with water quality and water quality and water and stormwater control?
Well, those are difficult ones to deal with. And you know, I don't have a good answer for you at this point. The water's running off now, right?
Oh yeah, it's running off into the street.
So it's a challenge,
You can't build up,
right?
store the water. You can't go down because you can't get rid of it. So you're in between the proverbial rock and the hard place.
Well, and since there's no storm sewer there, you can't put an underground manufactured device in place, it sounds like.
Correct.
You know, I guess the first thing that would come to mind, so you're increasing impervious area. Can you direct some of the runoff from the parking lot or the building into a green space?
No, we can't. No, the reason for it is it's the site's almost totally, where the site's runs to the street. Most of the green space is in the back of the lot. So you can't redirect it that way. It's just a tough site. So, well, I appreciate it, Richard. Thank you.
All right, we've got 2 more questions in the chat I think we can answer real quick. This is
Okay.
from Demetria. Can you please clarify redevelopment water quantity volume requirements versus water quality? If you reduce imperviousness by 20%, do you need to still do additional volume?
So if you start with impervious area, you reduce the baseline by 20%. No further requirements are necessary. All requirements were met by that.
Okay, question number 2. This is from Joe Herman. Is there any consideration for waiving detention requirements at downstream areas of a watershed where it would be advantageous to get that water out of there before the rest of the watershed starts contributing? And we assume it would require watershed-wide modeling.
Good question. The stormwater manual does address that to do in those situations to demonstrate that timing effects could have a negative effect by doing a stormwater study to show that.
Okay, that's all I see in the chat. And oh, we just had one more come in. For sites that are increasing impervious but have no storm sewer system, could groundwater infiltration such as permeable pavers be used?
I think that was probably mine.
Infiltration can be used if you can demonstrate by a field test that you have that infiltration rate of a ½ inch or more. Okay. Is that it, Abby?
That's it. You got your 3 questions. So I guess we'll let you off the hook.
Good, good. So we will now, I'm going to stop sharing and defer the next presentation to Doug.
All right, give me 1 second here. Do the old, can you see my screen question? Can you see my screen?
We can. You'll probably want to do slideshow or
Yep.
presentation view or whatever.
Yeah, I was just making sure I had the right side to start with.
Yeah.
There we go. I know you can see it because I can see it. All right, so I'm Doug Burton, Director of Engineering. I think most of you know me.
Sorry,
We
Doug.
oversee the-
I'm gonna interrupt you. Can you switch sides, display settings and then switch?
Yep. Yeah, that's what I was wondering if, there we go. Perfect. I didn't have any notes there anyway.
There you go.
All right, so most of you know who I am. So today, what I wanted to focus on is since it's redevelopment, often we see that being done by folks who maybe are new to the area. So we wanted to focus on, frankly, the problems that we see, and this isn't beat up on people. I feel like that what this feels like sometimes to folks, but it's just common little problems that we see that cause delays in development, especially in redevelopment, that if we can get ahead of these beforehand, then again, it just expedites the schedule, because, you know, we get the calls all the time from the developers or from the financiers saying, hey, what's the problem here? And we say, well, we're still waiting on X or Y or Z. So wanted to cover some of those things today and try to help folks involved in the development community avoid those delays, because, you know, time is money. So first of all, who should be applying? It's developer or the contractor. The engineer can file the application, but they're not the permittee. Why is this important? Well, unfortunately, it's important because if things go wrong, then we got to go back to the permittee, and we're not going to go after the engineer. We're going to go after the developer or the contractor, because they're the one that's controlling the site. So if we have an issue on site, we'll go back to the permittee. So as engineers, there's a lot of you on here. You are not the permittee, so please don't apply for it. You're often one doing the application and all the legwork. We get that, but the permittee is the developer or the contractor. Another weird one we've seen lately is it's also not the subcontractor. We've had a couple folks who are maybe blacklisted is the word, but a couple folks who've maybe had their hand slapped by either building inspection or us and aren't permitted to get permits. Well, they just have one of their subcontractors get it. The problem with that is that if the contractor who was prevented from getting a permit in the first place makes a mistake, then the subcontractor is left holding the bag. So, which can obviously get you some citations and some financial penalties, but also could get you permit blocked, which they were before. So just make sure that you're not working with someone who's trying to end around the system, because in the end, we're probably going to find out at the end, and it's just going to bite you in the butt. So next, everybody could read that, right? It's nice and clear. So this is, when I say keys to successful redevelopment, it's to any development. This is a spreadsheet that engineering and water quality and DES and Richard's group developed 2 or 3 years ago, with the goal of trying to eliminate some of those questions. And hey, I'm doing this, what do I do? Hey, I'm doing this, what do I do? Hey, I'm doing this, but also this and this, what do I do? So this flow chart kind of helps you from, are you doing development or redevelopment? Is kind of one of the first questions. And then as you go through, kind of gives you a, well, what's your next step and what's your next step and who should you talk to next? Because that's the problem that we get a lot of. The wrong person will get called, and then people just get delayed and time wasted by just simply calling the wrong person and playing tag. So this is on our website. I think Abby had already posted our website in the chat box, so you can see this on our website. And the colors kind of identify as who's responsible. So the green is the designer, the developer. The orange is the contractor, and then blue is us. So if you haven't reviewed this in a while, please review it, because again, it gives you that kind of, we tried to make it a catch-all, but you can't catch everything. So we understand there's always going to be instances where there's something we missed. You may go through this entire thing and not answer your question. Fine, give us a call. But odds are most of your questions, I think, could get answered by simply walking through this process, or at least that was our goal. If you find a massive hole in that, let us know, and we can update this to figure it out. So again, more keys to successful redevelopment. Make sure you're turning everything in complete. That's just probably one of the biggest ones that creates delays. People not turning in forms, turning in unsigned and undated forms that we've updated, 2 or 3 cycles ago. We'll see forms that are 10 years old. And then finally, and this is probably one of the more important ones, is make sure you fill out accurately and completely that executive summary, because that gives us, our reviewers, a 10,000 foot view on everything that you're doing. And that can really expedite their review process. Another thing that happens in the redevelopment sphere is that people think, well, it's under an acre, I don't need a permit. Yeah, you do. You might not need an NOI, but you still need a permit from us. So keep that in mind if you have on these smaller sites. Next, erosion sediment control. One problem that we've seen is that a lot of engineers have been doing work in this town for a long time, so they know how the process works. So they know if they notify us, we're just going to notify DWQ. So why don't we just skip a step and notify DWQ? Well, the problem with that is twofold. First, then it means the people who are controlling your permit, which is us, don't know where you're at in the steps. Also, it means you might be notifying the wrong person. If you're notifying one of the inspector you've always worked with, they may not be the one assigned to this project. So they either ignore your email or it just gets put off because it's not their role and responsibility. So notify us, we'll notify DWQ, they'll do their inspection, and then we'll issue your permit. So don't try to skip a step, because at the end of the day, it just costs you more steps. Inspections, I've beaten this drum. I know if folks have been to the construction conference we do in December, I've beat this drum multiple times. As the owner is supposed to have inspectors on site during the installation of those products requiring it, and then they're supposed to submit their reports and certifications. Sometimes what ends up happening is our engineering inspectors end up being the de facto on-site inspectors, which can't happen because we're there more of after the fact, not entirely during the process. We've got a limited number of inspectors here. We've basically got 5 inspectors to do all that, plus our surety folks. So 7 inspectors cannot inspect every site all the time. So make sure we're getting those, make sure your inspector's there and doing the reports and certifications. Next, we'll skip on over to sureties. One problem we see here on surety creation is that we need to be there for that process. So, get with Vaughn Atkins, who's our surety person, and she and one of the inspectors will do a walkthrough to make sure that both the engineers providing those surety calculations and us are on the same page. And what that helps to do is avoid confusion when we're trying to remove items from the sureties later. So if you did something that we wouldn't have agreed with later, then it's just going to cause hassle later. So make sure everybody's on the same page, do a walkthrough, make sure we're in agreement on that surety creation, and then it just simplifies everything after that, especially when you consider some of those items may be 2, 5, 10 years down the road. If everybody's on the same page on day one, it's a lot easier than trying to remember what everybody was thinking 10 years later, 5 years later. And then the one that causes some of the biggest issues is the sanitary sewers issues. Get those fixed ASAP. Those have a 3-year inspection. So if 3 years down the road, you've already got, you got the CO and there's people in the, let's say, an apartment, and you've got some sort of major sanitary sewer issue under that parking lot, and it's found during one of that 3-year inspection cycle, you don't want to rip it up then because you already have people living there. So make sure that it gets fixed before you really occupy that. So. Next, maintenance agreement. This is one that for a lot of those, since it's redevelopment, then you may see sometimes. And again, examples of that are the basins, the underground storage, pavers, the manufactured treatment devices. And what's the purpose of this maintenance agreement? It defines the inspection and the maintenance, basically what's to be done and where, and then who's responsible now and later, because obviously that changes. Who's responsible now is typically the developer. Who's responsible later is probably going to be the HOA or somebody to that effect. So what we've seen is that isn't well defined maybe in the initial maintenance agreement, and then 5 years down the road, the HOA says, I didn't know I was supposed to do this. So if we get the maintenance agreement clear on what's going to be done and when, again, who's responsible for that, it greatly simplifies things. So how do we play a role in that? Well, engineering's role is that we're there on the front end, helping with the design and construction review and making sure it's in compliance with our standards and regulations. And then we turn it over to, when it's complete, to DWQ, and they're there for the new inspection and regulation, or the yearly inspection and regulation. So one thing to keep in mind, that maintenance agreement form, the one that's online right now is a little out of date. It actually still has Jennifer Carey's information on there. We've updated it for Lindsay's information, but we haven't put that on the website yet because we're going to put some other updates up there as well. So if you have one where you're going to need that, just reach out to us, Josh. If you're more often than not, if you're doing redevelopment and you're doing one of these devices, it's probably commercial. So reach out to Josh and he can provide Josh Desarney, he can provide that information. So with that, any questions? And I don't follow Richard's 3 questions rule, so I'm okay with 0 questions.
Don't see any in the chat, but feel free to unmute if you have any.
Okay, thank you, Doug. If you'll stop sharing, we'll now go to Lindsay.
All right, we good to go?
You're good, we can see it.
Sounds good. Well, I am Lindsay Nicholas with Division of Water Quality, MS4 Program Manager. And just to kind of slide right into post-construction, right after Doug's presentation, we're going to talk about what it looks like after construction's done. So obviously this applies to development and redevelopment, but we may have some questions that are particular to redevelopment. And if you have those, please put them in the chat. You've seen this graph already in Richard's presentation. So kind of all the elements of our stormwater permit, the MS4 permit. And at this time with this presentation, we're talking about that post-construction piece of the pie. So, and in particular, you know, Doug kind of touched on a lot of this bullets at the beginning of this slide, but we're going to touch on that last one, ensuring adequate long-term operation and maintenance of post-construction BMPs or stormwater controls, kind of used interchangeably in this presentation, but we'll clarify some of that as we go. So when we look at that requirement, you know, what we're doing here and how do we do it? So this slide's all about the how, you know, keeping an inventory of everything in the city. And we'll get into some numbers later, just so you have some background on that, you know, maintaining procedures and checklists for how we're going to do compliance inspections of all these stormwater controls that have gone into the city, completing the inspections themselves, implementing repairs that fall under LFUCG's responsibility, implementing a program to ensure that private property owners conduct or arrange the repairs or maintenance that needs to be completed, having some sort of enforcement plan, our enforcement response plan that we follow for following up when repairs aren't completed or we need to escalate in some manner. And then also just doing one-on-one community training with folks as we go out and do the inspections, meeting with property owners where possible, trying to have that conversation first. And then we also prepare education videos each year, kind of bouncing back and forth between construction and redevelopment, or construction and post-construction. So we have a link to that later that I can pull up. So when we're talking about stormwater controls or BMPs, Richard kind of mentioned this briefly and what we're talking about here, but you know, there's the list of your stormwater controls in chapter 10 of the stormwater manual. For the most part, your stormwater controls are infrastructure designed or constructed to meet the water quality or water quantity or quality requirements that Richard mentioned at the beginning. So when you're talking redevelopment, it's that 20% reduction, or you know, and if you do that through pervious pavers, or if you're you don't hit the reduction and you're needing to install some sort of water quality or quantity device, then that's what we're talking about here. And just a note on this, you know, as you're in the design phase, one of the things to note that we deal with on the post-construction side of things is, you know, thinking about O&M and what that O&M requirements during the design phase. So in particular, providing access, noting where the outfall is located and that it's not outfalling onto someone else's property without the proper controls, you know, noting what's draining to it and how that may affect the BMP, or how it could inhibit pollutant removal, things like that. So Doug mentioned the maintenance agreement and just some things on our end, you know, and how that process and transition works. You know, once construction has reached, substantial completion as defined in the procedures manual, then we will complete, we being the Division of Water Quality MS4 section, our inspectors will complete an inspection. We'll get a list of those projects and we'll complete an inspection and ensure that that control is completed with no issues. It appears to be functioning as designed. And at that point, we look and make sure we have this commercial agreement. We use it as a basis for our inspection, and this is filed with the BMP so that we have it for all future inspections and have the contact information, and we have, what we need to the procedures or any sort of maintenance information that we would need in that. At that point, if it looks like it's functioning as designed and it's substantial completion and we're ready, then we'll add it to our inventory for long-term maintenance inspections. And we'll get into how often those happen in a couple slides. So just some quick notes on the agreement itself. From our side of things, make sure you're identifying all of the stormwater controls on the maintenance agreement. Sometimes we see different ones missing and have to kind of go back, and then engineering needs to go back to you and then back to us. So if you fully complete it, and then there's no issues, you avoid the back and forth. Making sure it's signed, providing the property owner contact for compliance, specifically the post-construction maintenance owner and representative name and contact info, so that if we have issues, we know who to contact. And then including, like I said earlier, all necessary maintenance information and specifications. All right, so just a quick thing on the numbers. This is our current inventory, and then just a couple non-compliance notes from last year. But right now, detention basins, retention ponds, underground detention, and private water quality BMPs kind of above that black line. Those are all things that we have. Those are kind of the outside, and then the inside public water quality BMPs and critical culverts. You can see kind of what we're dealing with as far as number and size in the community, and how many inspections were come back as non-compliant last year within these different categories. And with private, it changes every year. With private water quality BMPs, we are already almost at 21 this year, and it's only the end of March, so it just kind of changes year to year and what kind of weather we've had, or that type of thing. So you'll kind of see on this slide. And we'll get into some of those common non-compliant stuff at the end. I feel like I kind of skipped over that there, but we'll have some time at the end to talk about what we're seeing out in the field at the end of the presentation. So just to get an idea of what we're doing at Division of Water Quality within the post-construction realm. So we've got, our detention basins. We're out there, we're inspecting all of the detention basins, all, 1,232 twice a year. So we do 2 rounds of inspections. Retention ponds, we visit once a month. Underground detention is once a year from us, but then we also, you kind of see that note at the bottom, require that those be inspected by a PE annually, and that report is to be submitted to us by January 31st. So if you do have underground detention that you're planning in a redevelopment project or a project in general, just note that that's something that is required for the future of an underground detention or underground device itself. And that comes from our Section 16 ordinance, which we'll talk about in a second. Private water quality BMPs, we visit those once a year. We've got like 1,098, I think, right now in our inventory. Public BMPs, we do once a quarter, and then critical culverts, we do once a month, and after more than an inch of rain. So those are just letting you all know the things that we kind of do in this office. All right, so where does a lot of the maintenance of these, where does that come from within our ordinances? You'll see it's mostly section, 16, 8.6, 8.7, and 8.8. That's where we're talking about stormwater controls and ensuring adequate maintenance of them on private property. And so 87 is where we're talking about residential areas. So how do we make that distinction between what's LFUCG and what's private property and responsibility? And before I get into that, just really quickly, obviously with new development and you have, we require that stormwater controls be located on a single parcel where the land use is either residential or commercial, it doesn't matter. So that's, it's a single parcel, single ownership, and we know who's responsible for maintenance of that. But when you're in redevelopment or you're looking in older parts of the community, that's not always a clear line. So within the ordinance, if a public easement exists in residential areas, the private property owner, or hopefully usually an HOA, but not always, is responsible for the non-structural maintenance. So you're looking at mowing, sodding and seeding bare areas, cleaning up and maintaining tree and shrub areas, removal of accumulated debris, litter, tree limbs, all that kind of stuff. So, and then where there is a public easement, LFUCG is responsible for those structural repairs. You're looking at the integrity of embankments, structural things like concrete pipe, inlets, outlets, head walls, really severe eroded parts of the embankment, etc. But then where there is no public easement, the private property owner is responsible for non-structural and structural maintenance. So all this is spelled out in section 16 of our ordinance. So that can be found on our website as well. And then just one thing to note about from this section that comes up quite often in our inspections is that no structures or equipment shall be placed in the stormwater control. That we're talking fences, swimming pools, buildings, playgrounds, so that's something to keep in mind and something that comes up pretty often that we have to work with folks on. There's some other items in that ordinance as well, but those are just some of the key things. And then when we're talking section 16-88, that's where we get into more commercial industrial areas. And in this situation, the ordinance spells out maintenance is the responsibility of the property owner. So there we're talking about structural and non-structural. And they'll be notified in writing, kind of our inspection process is listed in that ordinance a little bit. So we'll be visiting those once a year or wherever it falls in the Bmp detention basin realm underground. And you would be notified from us if maintenance is needed, but obviously undergrounds would require an annual inspection on your end from the PE. And again, big thing from that one, no structures or equipment placed in the control. So just one thing to note, I just thought it might be helpful, just calling out general, like what our expectation is of property owners when you're looking at these different BMPs or stormwater controls. So, inspecting them regularly, the big one, maintaining the control by removing litter, debris, mowing the grass, seeding stabilized areas, a lot of that non-structural maintenance. If you keep up with it, making sure the path's clear, you avoid some of the bigger issues later on and, potential NOVs from us as we go out and see these every so often. And so a lot of these other things are items that are in the ordinance that I didn't call out on the previous slides, but, keeping trees off of dams, of structures, probably less, less of a thing with redevelopment, but still, not allowing structures to be built, preventing sediment or pollutant discharge into the control where possible. So on-site management, and then keeping files, keeping your maintenance plans so that you know what exists. And then I don't know if this link will work, but we do LexTV, and I might have to share a new screen in order for you to see that to be pulled up. Let's see. Is that the case? Do I need to reshare?
Yeah, I only see the presentation slide.
Okay. I'm just gonna do that real quick so you can see, and then I'll pull up something. I'll re-pull up the presentation, but so we have on, if you go to YouTube, LexTV, there is a playlist called Construction Best Management Practices that we should probably rename, but for now, that's what it's called. There are some videos in there that are pretty helpful that have been created throughout the years on, how Lexington's post-construction stormwater controls, how we maintain those BMPs, and there's the water quality units and best practices for maintaining those and inlet filters. So some good information there as well. All right, back to the presentation. All right, so what do our inspections look like? I think I have time. I'm doing good. So LFUCG inspection procedures. Our inspectors complete site visits to the stormwater controls. They make on-site observations, and then they're filling out a condition assessments to be completed. So they look at any of the repair and maintenance needs, and if there are any violations noted during that inspection, then they'll follow the enforcement response plan that we'll get into in a couple slides. And if a maintenance agreement does exist for that facility, then that is used as a tool for the inspection. You know, they're looking at the manufacturer's procedures for the device you provided. They're looking at any sort of write-up for maintenance and information that you provided in that agreement. So that's kind of where the importance of that agreement and the required maintenance for the things installed on the site come in handy. When they're out on the inspections, the big things that they're looking at, depending on the control, obviously, this is going to vary based on that long list of stormwater controls that was at the beginning. But, you know, the big things that our inspectors are looking at is upstream areas that drain to the BMP. So making sure that nothing is entering the inlet that can affect the BMP's performance. Physical components of the BMP, you know, making sure that berms, banks, the pieces, parts, concrete, metal, plastic, the components of it aren't broken or missing or falling apart, and that they're functional and intact. Extraneous structures, so there you have it again, the pools, the playgrounds, the things that we're finding in structures that where they shouldn't be. They're looking at vegetation. You know, is it covered with the appropriate vegetation for the maintenance plan? If it's supposed to be grass, is it mowed or managed properly? If it's, you know, more of a green infrastructure, does it seem to have the right plants in it per the maintenance plan provided? Then flow path is a big one that we see on a lot of inspection or NOVs that we send out, you know, making sure the flow path is clear, that water can drain through the BMP without a problem, whether that's the swale or whether that's an inlet filter that's clogged, you know, making sure that flow path is clear. Noting presence of pollutants, they're looking for if they've noticed anything that's coming into the BMP that maybe shouldn't normally be in there or that needs to be removed. And then downstream conditions. So making sure that the downstream area isn't eroded or rutted out, and that the water from the BMP is able to continue to flow downstream and not be inhibited. All right, so what does the enforcement response plan look like? So if a violation exists or they're noting some non-compliance with the BMP or the stormwater control, you know, on-site education and discussion is preferred where possible. A lot of times if we can't get a hold of the property owner, it's easier to just send the first NOV, but we have the option of sending the warning letter or an informal notice. But the NOV has been a useful tool in just getting the information to the right people with what they need to do, and then they reach out and contact us. So we will send up to 2 NOVs before we would submit it for enforcement escalation to the Division of Environmental Services, and that's where you get into more citation and fines. So on our end, you know, you would be looking at a notice of violation with what needs to happen. We give you 14 days. And then we'll go and do a follow-up inspection. And if we haven't heard from you or we haven't seen that any work has been completed, we'll send a second notice of violation, follow that same procedure, you know, try to reach out. And if we get nowhere with that, that's when we kind of ramp it up a little bit and go to DS to try to get something done and improved on the site. Again, inspectors conduct the follow-up inspections where violations are noted. And then within the NOV, you know, obviously we state the nature of the violation or the issue, what needs to be done to address it, the deadline, and kind of what our next steps are, just so that all that information's in there when we're sending that. And a lot of times you'll get the NOV with a picture and a map of where the BMP is, because sometimes there's property owner changes and they may not even know that they own it. So just trying to help out where possible. With redevelopment, I just thought we do have some policies on how we try to handle when BMPs are on multiple lots. Obviously, it's not the easiest situation to handle, but we try to do our best to do that. Where a homeowners association exists, obviously we try to meet with the HOA and then discuss compliance issues. And if we're not getting anywhere, we'll follow the enforcement response plan. If there's no HOA, meeting with the property owners, trying to discuss the compliance issues and attempt to resolve the issue with them. And again, if we need to use enforcement, we will. Individual property owners, the same thing, meet with the properties on site that are identified on the plat and development plan as being responsible for maintenance to discuss those issues. And then if a written NOV is required, sending it to the owners and kind of work on progress from there. So again, trying to deal with an unideal situation, but working with the property owner the best we can to do that and get towards compliance so that we're, treating water quality or detaining the water where it needs to be in order to make our systems function and do what's needed to improve water quality and quantity. So just some typical compliance violations for ponds. There's a lot there. But, for this one, especially when we're looking at ponds, basins, swales, other vegetated BMPs, we oftentimes will see a failure to mow or remove litter, debris, limbs, a lot of accumulated sediment. Those will be a lot of things, minor erosion, having to note that these need to be seeded or sod if there's bare areas, keeping that flow path clear are big ones, taking care of the vegetation, whether it's a landscaped area or is supposed to be vegetated with certain types of plantings. These are all things we'll try to note. And then obviously typical compliance violations for things like catch basin inserts, vaults, underground detention, rain gardens, pervious pavers. You're looking at getting access to them can sometimes be an issue. Cleaning the screens, obviously that's a big one because those fill up. So those will be notes that a lot of the times violations that we'll see, and just, remind the property owner that those need to be cleared, back the device out, clean it out. Monitoring upslope conditions, repair if the BMP itself is damaged. That's another big one that we'll note. Or failure to submit the required inspection reports for underground detention. That's another one that we'll see often. So I've just included some pictures throughout the years of just different things where obviously these need to be cleaned out or vacked, or, the litter needs to be removed, or, in the bottom right corner, sediment was blocking and that needed to be cleaned out, and to help with the flow path and get water flowing again through that BMP. So I feel like I kind of went quick there at the end, but felt like I was talking too long. So that's good. But that's all I have. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Hopefully that was helpful just to see the inside of what we do at Division of Water Quality and within the MS4 post-construction realm.
Okay, any questions? No questions.
I don't have a rule either, so that's fine, but happy to answer any if there are.
Well, if anyone thinks of one, you can hold them to the end or ask now. So next up is Gina Morris and Rainstorm with Third Rock Consultants. Third Rock is part of our program management team. They will be talking about 404 permitting. It seems to be always changing, and there's some new twists and turns to it. So Gina, you have the floor. Take it away.
All right, no try. Can you see our screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is Gina Morris. I'm a geologist and an environmental planner with Third Rock Consultants. And
this is Rainstorm. I'm an ecologist with Third Rock Consultants.
We're going to talk a little bit about water resources permitting in Kentucky. We're going to touch a little bit on 404 as well as 401 and recent changes that everyone is dealing with at this time. First question we're usually asked is, how do I know if I need a permit? Well, the first step in determining is to determine if there's waters of the US in the project area. Waters of the US are also jurisdictional waters for permitting purposes. The US ACE and US EPA jointly define waters of the US. This official definition is about a page long and it occasionally changes. But the simplified definition, as we currently apply it, means all navigable waters, all tributaries of navigable waters, and adjacent wetlands, ponds, lakes, any other water features in the area. So all streams, wetlands, ponds, lakes, and sometimes even ditches that are connected to a stream are waters of the US, and that makes them jurisdictional. So how do you know when you have a waters of US on your site? Well, if you've got lots of time, you can ask the Corps of Engineers to review your project site, and they can make an official determination. They call this a jurisdictional determination or a JD. When you get a JD from the Corps of Engineers, it lists all waters of the US on a site that would require a permit prior to any construction or disturbance on the site. And you can see the link here. If you go to the Louisville District Corps of Engineers website, there's a request you can click on there and ask them to do a delineation, jurisdictional delineation for you. You need to have a lot of time if you're going to wait for them to do it, however. And according to the Louisville District website now, they ask that you go ahead and obtain the services of an environmental consultant who's experienced with identification and delineation of waters of the US. And that way you have your evaluation done up front and you submit it to the Corps of Engineers, and then they can approve the jurisdictional determination that you submit to them. So this shows that sometimes you need the help of a professional to identify waters of the US and determine if you need a permit. That's what Third Rock does a lot of projects in permitting these days, and we're always happy to help. But one caveat is, a long time ago and for years and years, to determine if you needed a permit, you checked the USGS topographic mapping. And if you saw blue line streams on the map, that meant you needed to get a permit. And if you didn't see a blue line stream in your project area, you were good to go. But this is not the way it's done these days. And those maps are sometimes wrong about their guidance on what is a stream and what's not a stream, and that can be misleading. So it's better not to rely on those. Not all waters of the US are easily recognized. And the photo on the upper left is a roadside ditch that was actually determined to be a waters of the US, and it needed a 404 permit. The project engineer, all the engineers involved with that project were really surprised that that was a jurisdictional water. And the bottom photo is an emergent wetland that's also a waters of the US. The property owner in that case was quite surprised that that would need a permit to fill in or do any disturbance within. And he was actually in denial. He said, no way can that be a waters of the US. It's just a wet spot out in a field. So you have to be careful when you're looking at these, and know what you're looking at, or have somebody who can help you determine what is actually a waters of the US. So we wanted to focus a little bit on what has changed about the jurisdictional determination process and permitting. So as I mentioned earlier, the definition of waters of the US is sometimes revised. Currently, even channels that convey flow only after precipitation within 24 hours of a rain event are considered waters of the US, and they require 404 permits, and in some cases a 401 permit as well. These are called ephemeral streams by some people. Some people just say that's a ditch. But regardless, those are currently waters of the US.
Gina, we have a question.
Surely.
Does a road ditch have to be along a state road to be a waters of the US?
No, it doesn't. Whether or not it's waters of the US depends upon its connection with other surface streams. So if you have a roadside ditch that brings into a stream, that connects it and that makes it waters of the US. Now, of course, that ditch has to meet certain criteria too. It has to meet the definition of a stream, and it has to be a defined channel. So, you know, we look at other criteria, but roadside ditches quite often are waters of the US if they're connected with other streams. And this has changed through the years. Ephemerals were first considered jurisdictional about 20 years ago in Kentucky. And then for a while, a few years ago, that was taken off the table and you didn't have to consider ephemerals, but they now are jurisdictional again. So the way the definition changes and the way the regulations change and the way the regulations are actually implemented changes. So it seems like this is a constantly changing situation. So you need to stay on top of what the current procedures are for identifying waters of the US. Yeah. So what activities need a permit? Well, obviously, if you're doing any of the activities like it's shown on these slides, you would get in big trouble if you went out and did any work like that without a permit. But any activity that requires material to be placed in or equipment driven through or excavation to occur within the waters of the US must be authorized by the 404 and 401 permits. Even staging areas, if you're on a construction site or getting ready to proceed to construction, staging areas need to be careful to avoid waters as well. And you need to be careful that equipment isn't allowed to leak any kind of fluids into the waters of the US. So what types of permits are typically needed? When in Kentucky, you get 3 authorization letters from 2 different agencies. The US ACE application for Department of the Army permit is known as the 404 permit. You have to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers. Most of Kentucky is in the Louisville district, and that's who you submit your application to. You also have to get a 401 water quality certification permit from Division of Water. And in most cases, a permit to construct across or along a stream from Division of Water that's known as the floodplain permit. And another point to note is that the 401 water quality certification from the Division of Water must be authorized before the Corps can authorize a 404 permit. So these permits sort of go hand in hand, and we typically submit applications at the same time to both agencies. And normally the project manager at the Corps of Engineers will discuss the project with the project manager at Division of Water, and they sort of jointly go through their review process. A permit we use most frequently is the nationwide permit. That's a general form of permit that authorizes activities all across the country. There are 59 at this time, 59 separate nationwide permits for various activities. There's a nationwide permit for residential developments, one for commercial developments, one for utility lines, stormwater management, linear transportation projects, and so on. So there's 59 different activities that have their own separate nationwide permit. For these nationwide permits, sometimes the impact limitations vary a little bit, and the specific conditions that apply to each nationwide permit can vary. Occasionally you run into a project that might qualify for more than one nationwide permit. And in that case, the Corps of Engineers and Division of Water determine which nationwide to use. So we typically don't go into the permitting process and say, hey, we're going to use a nationwide 14 if we're not sure that's what we're going to use. Nationwide permits are reviewed and reissued every few years. Most recently, all of the nationwide permits were updated on December 27th last year. And that occurred right after the nationwide permits had been rescinded temporarily. In October, there was some kind of court case that originated in California, and it caused the Corps of Engineers to temporarily not use nationwide permits at all until they were reevaluated and reissued in December. You can go to the Corps of Engineers website and find the summary page that's listed on the slide. It tells you all the information you need to know about each nationwide permit, and it has a really nice summary table that at a glance you can determine what type of nationwide permit might apply to your project, or if there is a nationwide permit that would apply. I can't read. Oh, one question we're asked is, what's the difference between nationwide versus individual permits? The difference is the acceptable limit of the impact to a stream or wetland or combination of streams and wetlands on your site. If the impacts are rather minimal and activities likely covered by an existing general or nationwide permit, and the authorization letters you get from the Corps and Division of Water will state that. If impacts exceed the limit for a nationwide permit, a project must be authorized with an individual permit, and both the Corps and Division of Water have individual permits to issue in case you don't qualify for a nationwide or general permit. For the Corps of Engineers, an individual permit needs a 30-day public interest review that includes public notices and coordination with other agencies like US EPA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, any other interested parties, and the general public. And an individual permit from the Division of Water also requires a 30-day public comment period as well, and it requires a fee payment. And I think the beginning fee payments begin at $1,000 for your individual permit application, and it can go up from there. So another question we frequently get is, do I need to coordinate with any other agencies? Well, technically, the Corps of Engineers is responsible for coordinating with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and that is to comply with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. And they also are responsible for coordinating with the Kentucky Heritage Council, State Preservation Office, or SHPO, and that's required by Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. We've found that it expedites the permitting process if you can provide information and coordination letters from US Fish and Wildlife Service and the SHPO along with your permit application. That sort of greases the wheels and lets your approval come through quicker. And on the screen are the links for coordination with US Fish and Wildlife Service. That's to get an IPAC, which is a list of the endangered, threatened and endangered species in your project area, and also the link for the SHPO. And you can get a quick review of whether there are any National Register listed properties on your site or in the vicinity of your site, and if there are any other documented historic resources.
Oh, this one's mine.
Okay, Rain's going to continue now, and she's going to talk a little bit about mitigation and give an example of a recent project we conducted here in Lexington.
Yeah, so mitigation is always a big question when it comes to permitting. Mitigation basically means if you have an impact to a stream or a wetland that it exceeds the threshold for the Corps of Engineers, which is usually 300 feet of stream, or wetland impacts that are greater than 1/10 of an acre, you have to compensate for that loss in some way. In the past, you were able to do that by restoring something on your project site or restoring something near the project site and say that you were replacing that lost function within the watershed. Well, now the most the approved method to compensate for loss for your mitigation is to buy stream or wetland credits from an approved mitigation bank or from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. They have a program, it's their stream and wetland mitigation program. It's sometimes referred to as the fee in lieu of program, as in paying a fee instead of mitigating on site. So they call it the FILO. There's a website, they have a map that shows the different drainages and the cost for credits within their program. Right now for the Lexington area, if you needed to buy a stream credit, it's $330 per credit. Or if you need a wetland credit, it's $61,500 per credit. To come up with the number of credits that you need, you have to do some quality evaluation of your streams. You have to determine the flow regime. The table at the top of the slide shows the 3 different flow regimes of a stream. There's ephemeral, which only flows after it rains, intermittent, it flows part of the season, perennial flows most of the season. And then you do a quality assessment. It looks at the habitat that's offered by that stream, and you come up with its poor, average, or excellent. And there's a mitigation, it's a multiplier. So the table on the bottom is just an example of a project. If you looked at the first stream, stream number 3, it was determined to have intermittent flow and have a poor quality. So it has a mitigation ratio of 1. And in this example, there's an extra 20% included to compensate for temporal loss. And that's required if you buy your credits from the state FILO program. If you are lucky enough to have an approved mitigation bank in your watershed where you can buy credits, they're already on the ground and already been approved, that saves you a little bit of money for that 20% for temporal loss. Another question that comes is a big deal for permits is what about impacting habitat for endangered bats if you have to cut down trees? So in Kentucky, all trees are habitat for federally protected bat species. You get the Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat. So before the Corps can authorize your project for a nationwide permit or a general permit, they have to document that Section 7 has been handled. You either have to show that you don't have any bats in your trees, which is a survey. You have to hire a biologist to go catch bats and track them to their tree, or you can make a contribution to the Imperiled Bat Conservation Fund to compensate for the tree removal. So this little paragraph here is an example from a recent Corps letter where they authorized a project in Lexington, and it just says to mitigate for the loss of 0.4 acres of potential suitable roost trees, the permittee shall follow the process outlined in the Kentucky Field Office's 2016 revised conservation strategy for forest dwelling bats and provide receipt of appropriate contribution to the Imperiled Bat Conservation Fund. The permittee shall provide the Corps with a receipt of payment prior to any tree removal. So the Imperiled Bat Conservation Fund is administered by the Kentucky Natural Lands Trust. You can send them a check that has your Corps ID number on it, and they will return a receipt, and you forward that to your Corps permit reviewer, and they are able to check the box for Section 7 consultation. And bats are really the most common species that'll be listed for, especially in Project Fayette County. So to determine what your contribution for bat habitat impacts are going to be, you need to know how many acres of trees you're going to remove and what time of year that they're going to come down. And this table at the top is from some guidance documents that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has about how to apply your mitigation multipliers for bat habitat. In Fayette County, if you look at that last line, it says potential. That's all trees are potential habitat if they're, 3 to 5 inches diameter. So there's a list of known records of trees that have listed bats. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has some maps on their website that you can look at. In Fayette County, for Indiana bat, it's always going to be potential habitat. So if you look at the top, you can tell like what time of year you need to cut your trees down and figure out your multiplier. Sometimes for northern long-eared bat, you could have summer 1 habitat because there are some known trees that have roosting bats in the area. And just as one thing that has recently changed, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing the northern long-eared bat to be an endangered species instead of threatened. As of this month, it's still in the public comment period. So what that will change for people doing projects is that up until now, they've known that the northern longleaf was a threatened species, and they had what they called the 4D rule, which said, unless you're in vicinity of a tree where we know they are, then you're probably not going to impact those bats, and you can take your trees down without consultation. Well, if it is listed as endangered as they're proposing, then that 4D rule is going to go away, and the northern longleaf bat is going to be, there'll be more consideration for impacts to the habitat for that species, probably more surveys, which means there'll be more records and things might change with that. But the table on the bottom is an example how to calculate your fees. In this example, they need to take out 10 acres of trees. They're in a swarming 1 habitat, which means they're near a cave where the bats tend to go in the fall. They hibernate in caves during the winter, but in the fall, they congregate at the opening of the cave, and they forage and they fatten up and they mate and they do a bunch of stuff that's really important for their life cycle. So those areas around caves have more protection. You're not going to have that in Fayette County unless somebody finds a new record. As of now, I don't think there are any caves that have endangered bats in this county, but for that example, they're going to remove some trees between April and August. So they take their 5 acres of trees and multiply it by 2, and then multiply that by the current rate per acre, which is a little outdated. It's closer to $4,000 now. And then they got 5 acres of trees that are coming down in the summer, which is a more critical time for the bats because that's when the pups are under the tree, at the bark of the trees. And if you're removing trees during June and July, you have a much higher multiplier because the pups are not able to fly yet. So if you cut down a tree that has bats with pups, it is considered a take of an actual species. So that's how you get to your bat fees.
Irene,
Yeah.
Doug Baldwin has asked, does honeysuckle qualify as a potential tree?
No, it doesn't. It's not. It really has to be something that has the potential for loose bark or cracks and crevices. But all of our projects, when you have just a honeysuckle field, we've never had Fish and Wildlife say that we need to consider that bad habitat. Okay. So, here's just a slide that says, what should I include with my 404 and 401 permit applications? It's always important to put good mapping. We always include a topo map and an aerial map with the site boundaries and maybe the coordinates called out just to make it easy for your permit reviewers to identify the project. The big thing that's critical are site plans with the limits of disturbance clearly defined. So your project doesn't have to be at 100% design in order to apply for permit applications, but it's important that your limits of disturbance are not going to change. We like to wait, if we can get 60% design plans, that's usually a good point to apply for permits. You know that the boundaries aren't going to change, and most of the changes at that point are, to other structures besides the site plan. If you have your Waters of the U.S. delineation report and your JD, that definitely needs to go with your application, and a table that shows all your impacts to the waters of the U.S. So you list your streams and your wetlands, you list how many feet of stream impact and how many acres of wetland impact. And if you exceed those limits of 300 feet of stream or a 1/10 of an acre of wetland, then you need to include a mitigation statement that says, here's how we're going to deal with our mitigation. We're going to buy credits from this bank or use the FELO program, or if you happen to be in a watershed where there's no available credits, you can still do on-site or permittee responsible mitigation. And then one difference about the applications, the 404 and 401 applications can be very similar. The floodplain permit, though, those guys want proof of public notice from a local paper. So you got to ask for tear sheets and affidavits from the paper to submit with your application. And then how do you apply? You can send your application materials through email to these addresses. That first one, the door to the core, the way that works, if your application is too big to email, you can just send their cover letter and a statement of intent. It goes directly to the branch chief. He'll respond and say, I've assigned this to so-and-so and copied them on this email. And then at that point, you know who your permit reviewer is, and you can get them all your additional documents through links or whatever you need to do. Same thing with Division of Water. There's 2 different email addresses. One goes to water quality certification. One goes to your Division of Water floodplain branch. And then when you get a response, you know who you're working with for those as well. And then, so we have an example project I'd like to talk about. This one was authorized with Nationwide Permit 39, which is for commercial and institutional developments. This nationwide permit, the Corps can use this one if your impacts are less than ½ an acre, and that's combined your wetland impacts plus your area of stream. And that as long as you meet all the other general conditions, which one of the conditions for the Corps permit is that you get your water quality certification from the state. The state has certified that Nationwide Permit 39 is acceptable in Kentucky with some additional conditions. One of their conditions is that your stream impacts cannot exceed 300 feet. So in essence, Nationwide Permit 39 in Kentucky has a 300-foot stream limit because of the state special conditions. Then you have to get that water quality certification before you can get the Corps' approval. So this is a project that we worked on a couple of years ago. I think it fits pretty well with redevelopment. It was over in the Hamburg area. An expansion of an existing commercial development was proposed, and they wanted to move this head wall and this stormwater channel. And I think somebody from the city looked at the plans and said, you probably need to make sure you don't need a permit for this because maybe that's a stream. So this is the channel in question. And the first question we had to ask was, is it waters of the US? We knew from historic photos that there wasn't a channel in this place originally before this area was developed, but the hydrology of that whole site's been changed. And there's water flowing from this pipe a lot of the time. There's an ordinary high water mark. There's substrate sorting. There's a community of aquatic organisms and algae, and most of the organisms that were in this stream are very pollution tolerant, which, you know, probably indicates that this water quality is not great, but they also indicate that they're able to support most of their life cycle in that channel. So it was determined to be a stream, despite the, you know, urban, disturbed, man-made situation it was in. So here I went through and looked at sort of the timeline of that project. Just as an example of how the process can go. We got notice to proceed from our client in the end of August, and we went out to our site assessment, put together a Waters of the US delineation report, and got that back to the client in the first part of September. They decided to go ahead and proceed with the jurisdictional determination request to the Corps of Engineers. So we submitted that to them the first part of October. And by the end of November, we'd received the signed JD back from the Corps of Engineers that said, yes, this is the waters of the US, and if you're going to impact it, you need authorization. So after some discussion with the client about how to proceed, which involved, can you change your design? Are there are there way to avoid this happening? Which there wasn't. So we proceeded to initiate some coordination with the SHPO, and we also did the IPAC consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and got a list back from them that said, of course, you have to consider bats if you're working in this part of the world. Got all that stuff taken care of, did little memos for each, looked at historic photos, and was able to provide SHPO with some good documentation to prove that that area had been disturbed in the past and there were unlikely to be any historic resources there. And also there were no trees that were of a size and quality for bat habitat. And we submitted the whole application package with our coordination and our memos to the Corps of Engineers and Division of Water on February 4th. On February 7th, we got our letter back from SHPO, so we were able to forward that to the Corps reviewer. And by March 8th, the floodplain permit was in hand. And by March 19th, the Division of Water had authorized the water quality certification. And by the end of March, the Corps gave the authorization letter for Nationwide Permit 39 for commercial and institutional developments. So it was a little over 6 months to go through that whole process for a project that everybody thought was pretty straightforward, simple relocation of 54 feet of a channel with a head wall or pipe. And so just to end our presentation, there's some flow charts from the Army Corps' website. That's where it goes through this whole process. They start, with your environmental due diligence, you do your delineation. So you go out there and say, here are our streams, here are our wetlands. And then if you want to submit that request for JD to the Corps, They'll review and say, yes, you have waters of the US. And if you have an activity that's going to fill those or drive through them or equipment near those things, you probably need a permit. If they come back and say none of your features are waters of the US, then you don't need a permit and you can proceed with your project. Once you have that jurisdictional review though, and the application review flow chart is, can you avoid your impacts? Yes, no permit required. No, then permit required. Does it fall under one of the existing nationwide permits or general permits? If the answer is no, then you might have to go the individual permit route, which would be specific to your project. Takes a little bit longer because of the public notice time period, but it's not the end of the world to find out you get an individual permit. With that, Gina and I like to talk about permits. So if anybody's got any questions, let us know. And our email's there if anybody wants to follow up afterwards.
We'd be happy to answer any questions now.
Gina, Rain, this is Richard. I have a hypothetical example I'd like you to comment on.
Okay.
And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious what your thinking would be. As I was listening to you talking, I thought of this example that probably comes up occasionally. So let's make the assumption that we have a stream that's a jurisdictional wetland or jurisdictional stream.
Okay.
And it's a project that involves constructing a storm sewer, and the head wall, because of the nature of the site or whatever, is going to be in the bank of the stream. So maybe we're impacting 30 feet of stream.
Right.
It's a jurisdictional stream. Obviously, it's got to be covered by a nationwide permit, I would think. So just take us through how you think that would be permitted.
We'll take that.
Yeah.
Well, so there's a technicality, I think, that if you know for sure your project falls under one of those nationwide permits, you can submit a pre-construction notification to the Corps that says we're going to proceed, and if we don't hear from you in 45 days, we're covered. But I rarely go that route with any of my clients because most of the time it's good to have the letter from all the agencies that you're covered. If you're working under the ordinary high water mark of that channel, you really need to coordinate with floodplain. You need to submit your applications and give them the time to respond with a letter that says your activity is authorized. You do need authorization for that activity because you're working in waters of the US, and it does fall under your nationwide permit. So it shouldn't be a problem. It's just taking the time to get those authorization letters. And, one thing I wanted to notice, the Corps has this procedure outlined on their website that you pursue the jurisdictional determination and you get that in hand, and then you go through the application process. But in reality, if you submit your JD request with your permit application, you'll get priority over anyone who's just submitting a JD request. And they say that on their website. So, in that situation, I would go ahead and submit the JD, fill it out, say, we're assuming that this is a jurisdictional feature and here's our activity, which we assume is authorized under this nationwide permit, and let them reply with a yes or no. Now they still have to consider SHPO and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, and they'll not just look at right where your project impact is, but the whole project. So by working within the banks of the waters of the U.S., you open up that review for your entire project area.
And we've found that it usually, to be on the safe side, it's better to go ahead and coordinate with the Corps of Engineers. Even if you think you don't have to have a permit, even if you think you don't have any jurisdictional waters, just to be safe, it's a good idea to have that coordination. And we have worked in some areas where the city engineer or the county engineer actually requires us to provide a letter from Division of Water and the Corps of Engineers stating that they don't have any jurisdictional waters. Of course, if we do the JD coordination through the Corps, we would have that. But we've also been required to get letters from Division of Water stating that there are no jurisdictional, well, no streams that Division of Water would have jurisdiction over either.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Gina. Thank you, Rain. That concludes our presentation. Abby, you want to go back over the PDHs and the evaluation survey that we're going to do?
Yes, when you exit the meeting, an evaluation survey should pop up on your screen. One of the questions will ask if you would like a PDH certificate. Just mark yes if you'd like that. And if you do not get the evaluation survey, just send me an email and we'll make sure you're on the list.
And just for clarification, the form actually asks you to put your name and email in a written box if you want the form. So it's not yes or no, but just anticipate having to type.
Okay, so we finished a little early. Before we adjourn, are there any other questions that anyone may have? Okay, well, seeing none, again, thank you for joining the workshop. We hope it was valuable and that you got some good information out of it. If you have any comments you would like to submit us in writing by email, feel free to do that. And I believe that's it.
Yeah, we've had a couple of people ask about getting recordings. So we're working on getting that up in various manners. So we'll reach out once that's either up on our YouTube or on our Stormwater page so that folks can have a recording of the workshop.
Okay, very good. I see a question, will the third rock presentation be available? The answer to that is yes, right, Lindsay?
We have the presentation, so we can share that, but we also will have the recording that we'll be making public on the website. So there'll be different options, but you can reach out to me.
Okay, so the slides of all these presentations will be available as well as the recording.
They can be available. I don't know if we're posting, if we'll post a video, we might not post the presentation PDFs themselves, but we can. Mhm.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Have a nice weekend and we'll talk to you later. Bye.